What's going on, everybody? My name is Sage, and today I would like to bring you a video about the current state of Feral Druid, in my opinion, on the Shadowlands beta. We have a little over a month right now until Shadowlands actually hits the live servers, and as we start getting closer and closer, people are asking more and more questions about where they see their characters or how people see their characters. So I wanted to start a series on the Feral Druid itself and go over each covenant in different videos. So this video today, we are actually going to be deep diving more so into the Night Fae Covenant for the Feral Druid. I am currently Night Fae on my Tauren here, and I want to go over the abilities, all the conduits, the soul binds, the synergies I see with all of them, and where I could see the Druid shaping up within the Night Fae Covenant itself. Choosing your Covenant is going to be a concrete thing that you have to do. You can swap around with obvious penalties for doing so, but going into the start of Shadowlands, Blizzard has already announced that they're going to stick to their guns and they're going to make sure that we have to pick a Covenant and stay within it. Now, obviously, further down the line, they can make changes to this, but currently this is a big decision that every character has to make. They want you to be a Night Fae Druid, and so on and so forth with the other covenants. So today we're going to deep dive into the Night Fae Feral Druid. Alright, so diving into the Night Fae Feral Druid, first we want to look at some of the base abilities that we have pretty briefly, just so that when we do start referencing to the conduits and the soul binds, we can start seeing some of the synergies. The same thing with the legendary, start seeing some of the synergies that we have. So going over the changes real quick that they did to our talents and to some of our abilities. So going over the talent row, most of the talents actually have not been changed. Most of them are relatively the same. Some of them have just been tuned slightly or buffed a little bit from live, but there are a few things that have changed. So the first row, we still have Predator, which is your main AoE one. Every single time something dies, you get a reset on Tiger's Fury, as long as it has a bleed on them. Sabretooth, they did nerf this a little bit, but not the damage potential from it. What they nerfed on it was how many seconds it refreshed your rip from 4 down to 1. Honestly, I don't think that this was a big enough nerf to Sabretooth. If they were trying to get this to not be selected, it's still very, very strong. By far, I still think it's the strongest single target talent that you'll end up taking, and you will still continuously take this for single target as of right now, at least from what I've tested and seen. Lunar Inspiration, they have buffed this several times at this point, sometimes indirectly because they buffed Boomkin or just the entire Druids kits on dots. So the last beta build iteration, they buffed Moonfire again. So it's continuously making Lunar Inspiration stronger and stronger and stronger. However, Lunar Inspiration doesn't really have any other synergies outside of it's a damage dot over time that you can cast. It only costs 30 energy, and there are some legendaries that do have some effectiveness with it. However, the problem is that it doesn't really have any other synergies within other abilities. It doesn't play off of other abilities. It's a fire and forget, make sure you refresh during its pandemic type of an ability. You're not going to use this continuously to try and proc up something. In the past, we used this ability very briefly at one period so that we could not utilize our Blood Talon procs if we accidentally procced it before we wanted it to, or that you wanted to make sure you procced it so you didn't waste a Primal Swiftness, but that was in the past. It's no longer the case because of the way Blood Talons is, which we will get to. So the row 25 is relatively unchanged. Nothing's changed here. You still have a change, which is Tiger Dash to your dash, which makes it on a shorter cooldown, and you go 200% speed, reducing gradually over 5 seconds, 30% heal, and Wild Charge in its various forms, which is extremely good. Now, on this row right here for our affinities, they did change this. And what they did is they tied some of our secondary utility abilities to our affinity abilities now. So Balance Affinity comes with Typhoon and all the Moonkin abilities. Guardian Affinity comes with the 6% damage reduction, Frenzy Regeneration, and Incapacitating Roar. And then Resto Affinity gives you Ysera's Gift for the 3% heal every 5 seconds, all the healing spells, and your Soul's Vortex, which is very good utility. On this next row right here, the big change here is going to be Heart of the Wild, and it actually makes it very hard for Feral Druid specifically to pick the other two when Heart of the Wild is a damage cooldown. Heart of the Wild, though, is reliant on what you've picked on the previous tier, and that makes it kind of difficult to understand and like, okay, well, I want to pick this one because I want to be able to off heal at certain points, and that might be good in Mythic Plus. But if you're looking purely for, damage potential, then you're going to go balance, because it's the only one out of the three that will give you that damage potential. And Heart of the Wild, if you select the balance affinity, the damage of your balance abilities increase by 30%, and Star Surge is instant. Now, this will come into play later on when we start talking about the Covenant ability itself. But the other two are still the same. Mighty Bash is a stun, a single target stun, and then Mass Entanglement it'll entangle everything around you. Soul of the Forest has remained relatively unchanged. The passive 5% increased damage on your finishing moves is huge, and the energy that you gain per combo point on a finisher actually has some very good synergies with some of the legendaries that we will talk about later on. This was the strongest talent in this row in BFA, and it's still looking to be extremely strong here at the start of Shadowlands. Savage Roar, they buffed it by 5%, but it's not enough because of the amount of time you have to put into creating the 5 combo points to then activate it, and then having to make sure you keep it up over and over and over again throughout your rotation. The 15% damage increase is just not making up more than what you're spending on time and damage you're losing spending on time to keep it up, is pretty much the drawback of Savage Roar. That, and the fact that before it was a snapshotting ability that we could throw on our bleeds when our bleeds were our single target damage, we're not really built around our single target bleeds anymore. So Savage Roar is very hard to play right now because of those instances. Now, Incarnation, King of the Jungle. This was a great cooldown that made our Berserk an actual cooldown in BFA. Currently, though, they have actually swapped places for Berserk and for Incarnation. So all of the damage potential, having your Rake and your Shred do damages as if they were from Stealth, has now been moved to Berserk itself. And Incarnation instead increases the duration by 10 seconds, from 20 seconds to 30 seconds, and then the energy reduction that you had from Berserk has been converted over to Incarnation, but at a reduced value. It used to be 40% for Berserk, and now it's 20% instead, which gives you that little bit of a boost, but it actually nerfed Incarnation as a selection on this talent row. Pretty big, I would say. The extra 10 seconds is nice, and the energy generation can be good depending on the type of build you're going to be doing, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Currently, it's not looking very strong in most of the builds I've played in comparison to just having Soul of the Forest. Now, row 45. This is probably the worst tier of talents that we have, for several reasons. The biggest issue going into Shadowlands with this row is the fact that there is an AoE cap now, and 2 of the 3 abilities on here are affected by the AoE cap. So Blood Scent, each enemy hit by Thrash reduces the cost of swipe by 3 energy for the next 6 seconds. Now this was pretty much a dead talent back in BFA. Nobody selected it because it didn't outdo the damage potential of what Primal Wrath could. Now it does even less because swipe is AoE capped to 5. Thrash is not. Thrash, you can hit everything. It's not a very strong ability currently, and it's more of an ability to buff other abilities because Swipe does increase damage if you hit a bleeding target. Now, Scent of Blood, though, is a capped ability, so it's hard to say that that's something that's going to be taken. Brutal Slash is still in the same position it was inside BFA. It is more of a cheaper AoE, or not AoE, single target combo point generating ability. It doesn't do the amount of damage you're hoping for when you're looking at AoE burst damage and having those 3 charges of a quick AoE cleave like burst damage. It just doesn't do that, especially like if anybody remembers back in Legion. This was a very good spell when it first came around. It was very, very strong, and you want to use it in things like Mythic Plus or AoE fights where things died very quickly. But both of these abilities in an AoE scenario, since it is an AoE row technically, none of these compare to Primal Wrath. Primal Wrath is an ability, you use it as a finisher, and it AoEs your rip across all the target. It does initial damage and puts your rip up on all your targets for 12 seconds. This is huge because it's uncapped, and it's probably one of the biggest things that we have as a Feral Druid bringing it into Shadowlands is the fact that we can Primal Wrath AoE everything. So I'm really hoping that they stick to it, that this should not be AoE capped. It's one of the strengths that Feral Druid does bring in Shadowlands in comparison to some classes that are hard capped across most of their abilities. But Primal Wrath is the by far go-to for all scenarios unless it's purely single target just about, and then Brutal Slash will come into play, using it as a combo point generator ability. At this point though, it depends on how you generate and maybe certain legendaries that you're taking, if you'd even use Brutal Slash as a single target ability. Now, the last row, row 50. All of these abilities are actually pretty decent. They're used for different scenarios, but then again, at the same time, there's some that are just going to come ahead. Moment of Clarity is actually very strong going into Shadowlands, because everybody's going to be energy starved, because you're stat starved at the beginning of an expansion. You're working on getting all your gear back and stuff. So Moment of Clarity is pretty strong with that, and having energy increased is always a great thing for Feral Druids, because it allows us to just not only just keep hitting the abilities we want to, it allows you to pull efficiently and not waste any energy. A lot of times you're pressing Tiger's Fury and you're overcapping on energy pretty consistently, because you're using Tiger's Fury to snapshot onto your bleeds instead of using it as more of that energy potential gain. You do end up getting a lot of that energy with Predator, and having a bigger energy pool does help with that. Going into Blood Talons been massively reworked a couple times now, a few different iterations. The current iteration that they're going with right now is when you use 3 different combo point generating abilities within 4 seconds, the damage of your next 2 rips or ferocious bites is increased by 30%. In my opinion, I don't like this. I do like the one that's currently on live, where we're using our Primal Swiftness to use Regrowth to generate our next 2 melee abilities with an increased damage. They did buff it by 5%, but it's only on finishers now. You can never buff another spell again. Currently on BFA and prior to BFA, you can use Blood Talons to buff Rake, mainly Rake and then Rip, Rake and then Ferocious Bite, or Rake and then you might even do it into a Shred. Some people can do it into Thrashes. The point is that you could have buffed up these other abilities at your will, and you can't now. The big kicker in this one is that you have to use 3 different combo point generating abilities, so you have to use 3 different ones. So it puts Thrash back on the single target rotation, even though it's not doing a bunch of damage. It definitely doesn't do a lot of damage on single target at all. It is purely there to help buff certain spells. Now, Blood Talons is not the only thing that Thrash will be able to help generate later on, but Thrash will be the main one for it. Brutal Slash will come into play if you use that on single target, and if Lunar Inspiration does become a more powerful ability single target, if it does somehow overtake Sabretooth, which currently I'm pretty sure it doesn't throughout all my testing, then that is also another combo point generating ability that you can have that will be able to help you proc your Blood Talons effectively. You only have to proc Blood Talons every other combo point generating phase. So every other combo point generating phase, you're going to want to generate that again, because you have 2 procs of it. So you'll generate it on your way to your first finisher. You use 1 proc on that first finisher. The second one, you're good to go, because you still have another one. That third one, you have to press 3 different ones. But most of the time, it actually works out decently with some of the durations of the bleeds, because you'll end up using those 3 bleeds just to keep them rolling anyway. You'll get your Blood Talons up. Feral Frenzy is still what it used to be. It's a big burst of damage that happens really quickly. It gives you 5 combo points, so you can do a quick finisher at the end of it. It's not a bad ability. They did buff it. Definitely still think this is more of a PvP orientated talent on this row. It's good for burst, but it's 45-second cooldown, which is not good for most PvE scenarios, especially when compared to the other 2 that help benefit from all damage. Blood Talons will do its damage to all your finishers, and then Moment of Clarity is something that helps you continuously do damage through your entire rotation and not every 45 seconds. Feral Frenzy was pretty nice with some of the previous iterations of Blood Talons that they had. I did use it in a couple builds just because it helped bridge the gap with some of the combo point starvation, because you don't have that much crit at the beginning, and also it being energy deprived, being able to press 1 button, that's 25 energy, did help with some of that at the beginning, but overall I don't believe it's going to be taken over the other 2. Alright, so going into the soulbinds for Night Fae Covenant itself, because we're only doing the Night Fae deep dive right now for Feral Druids and how they're looking, and what I think are probably going to be the best potential outcomes for Feral Druid looking at these abilities. So first I wanted to go over the Conduits themselves. The Conduits are pieces of gear that you will get from dungeons, some outside content, PvP, and so on, that you'll be able to obtain and then place in here, kind of like our Essence system back in BFA. And then once you place them inside here, you get this library here that I have on the right hand side once you've learned them all. This is beta, so I've learned them all. And then you have these feral ones that are up here. Now each one of the soulbinds that I have are going to be using some of these slot in gem type relics, which are our Conduits. So the Feral Druid one specifically, we have Carnivorous Instincts. Tiger's Fairy's damage bonus is increased by 3%. This is great. It's just a flat damage increase to Tiger's Fury. Tiger's Fury being our main damage enhancing ability that we really have. It's the most used one anyway. Having that just have a 3% that will scale up as we get more ranks of these later on in the expansion is great. It's hard to just throw away 3%. Having also the talent Predator, where you can keep proccing it after deaths, will mean that you'll have that additional 3% on top of your 15% base, so 18% in total right off the get-go. 18% increased damage for everything that you do, which is great. Incessant Hunter is rips damage, has a 10% chance to grant 3 energy. Now, energy, especially in dungeons where you'd be using Primal Wrath to spread rip to effectively get the energy from this, you'll be having Predator most of the time with that too, so you won't probably be using this, especially at the start. Now, there is a legendary that we'll go over later on it's called Apex, Apex Predator, that might have some synergy with using this to build up energy instead of the resets of Tiger's Fury to then use Sabretooth on its procs. So we'll go on that a little bit later, but currently this one's probably not the best build one for it. There is a chance that it could have some synergy with a certain build though. The next one we have is Sudden Ambush. Now this one I like a lot just because it adds something to the rotation for Feral Druids to be looking out for. Feral Druids, yeah, we have a lot to manage already with our bleeds, our combo points, our energy, and so on. However, I love the Spinning Plates build that we used to have in the past, where it was all about snapshotting and monitoring bleeds and bleeds up times and how powerful our bleeds were. And this kind of brings a little bit of something back to it. And what it is your finishing moves have a 3% chance per combo point spent to make your next rake or shred deal damage as though you were stealth. And what that means is pretty much when this procs, you want to be using it on rake to have an empowered rake when you can, because then that will snapshot its power across the duration of your rake. And when we were just talking about on the talent section, how Blood Talons will no longer allow you to buff your rake, Sudden Ambush will. However, the current level of this is not very strong because it doesn't proc very often. I don't think it's stronger than the other conduits that we have to select from for potency, and I think that this might be something that will come into play once we get further ranks of it, but the current rank of having 3% per combo point, I don't believe is going to be strong enough to make it to the end, to have that build up of what you want for the damage, because then you get that 15% chance to proc this after every finisher. Now granted, finishers are very strong, but you're not using finishers a massive amount, so you're only getting 15% chance off of each of those finishers. During a boss fight, or definitely a fight in the dungeons, which are shorter, you might not get very many finishers to even proc the 15% chance to proc this. And that's what makes that a little lessened right now. I think this one, I believe this one goes up to 35% eventually. And when it gets up to where you can have a 35% chance every finisher to proc it, it'll probably be something that's a little bit stronger. If it can be more reliable to proc that damage increase. The big one that we have is this one right here, which is another reason why Sabretooth is probably going to be the go-to always for single target. Ferocious Bites deals 3% increased damage for each of your bleeds on the target. Generally speaking, we have 3 bleeds that we place on the target with Rake, Rip, and Thrash on the target, and each one of those bleeds will continuously give all of the Ferocious Bites that we deal on the target that additional increase. It'll give it its 9% increase every single time, which is big, which is another reason for Sabretooth, which is a 20% increased damage to Ferocious Bite. So you have that 20% increased damage, and then 9% increased damage from just this one conduit. And this is the lowest level of this conduit, so this one will rank up and just be that much more stronger for that build, for those really big bites. After that, every covenant also has a covenant conduit. If we're talking about pure damage wise, the pure damage wise one for Night Fate itself is Conflux of the Elements, and what that is while channeling Convoke the Spirits, damage and healing are increased by 12%. Now this is huge because your Convoke the Spirits is a very big spell. We haven't gone over it just yet, but it's a channeled spell that does 12 different spells in 4 seconds of Druids. Increasing all 12 of those spells by 12% is huge. It's just a pure damage gain across the board. These ones right here are just potency conduits, which are all these conduits over here that have this cross on them, this X on them. All right, our potency conduits as Feral Druids are very strong, I believe, for our toolkit, so we will be using them where we can. However, there are two other kinds of conduits that we can get. We have a finesse conduit, and we also have endurance conduits, which we will be able to select a few of these within the path. The path I'm currently showing is Corian, and in his path of taking 3 potency conduits to get to the end here, we do have 1 endurance conduit. So if we scroll down and we go to our endurance section, we have a few endurance conduits that we can place in there. The first one is Innate Resolve. Regrowth and Frenzy Regenerations, healing is increased by 12% on yourself. Okay, the regrowth is the big one here, especially for Feral Druids, because now that we don't have to use our Primal Swiftness procs for damaging capabilities with proccing Blood Talons, we have a free heal that we can use if we want to. We don't have to use it in a rotation now. You don't have to waste the GCD on it if you don't need it, but it's very good survivability if you have 12% increased healing on your regrowth and you have a free one every 5 combo points. You have a free regrowth that you can throw on yourself and just continuously have your health going, which is big. We're one of the few DPS classes that can just keep that hot up on themselves continuously. A lot of people have leech and other ways of getting some health back. We can literally just heal ourselves while in cat form, and that's a big survival capability for us. The other one is Tough as Bark. Bark Skin's cooldown is reduced by 10%. This one's not bad because Bark Skin is a baseline ability for all Druid specs now, which is pretty strong. Having that 20% DR every 1 minute, and then this one right here will reduce it obviously by 10 seconds from that. It's okay. I don't think it'll be as strong as Innate Resolve just for that constant healing, because we can heal ourselves that much more, but it is not a bad option either. Yurson's Vigor is definitely more of a tank conduit. For 4 seconds after shifting into bear form, your health and armor are increased by 12%. This might be pretty good for PvP as well, but it's mainly going to be for tanks, especially since bear tanks have that issue of going into packs with having to build up iron first stacks. This will kind of help them mitigate a little bit more damage going into a pack. Layered Main is pretty much as Pure Guardian, and so is Well-Horned Instincts, so we're going to skip past those. The finesse ones are for all specs though. So Born Anew is Rebirth grants the target 50% movement speed for 8 seconds and Well Fed, increasing their primary stats by 20 for 1 hour. This is just an enhanced Rebirth, which is great because Rebirth is one of the few things that we bring to groups, and we can have an enhanced version of it. They did bring back an Engineering Res, so it took a little bit of our specific class utility away, but this gives us a even better reason to have us as the person in the group doing the battle reses, so that we can give them an increased battle res capability. This will be great for Mythic Plus as well, because it gives them well fed with some primary stats right off the get-go. Born of the Wilds, the cooldown of Mighty Bash, Mass Entanglement, and Heart of the Wild are reduced by 10%. This is just giving your utility abilities a little bit of an edge off. It's not that great as far as like a big reduction, but it's not horrible either. I think Born Anew is better for group content. Born of the Wilds might be better for just some solo stuff, possibly PvP for sure, because you're not going to battle res in PvP. Front of the pack, Stampeding Roar's radius and duration are increased by 15%. This might be a very good one and a competitor for Born Anew for raid comps, depending on the fight. You might want this one in there just to help increase the radius and the duration for the entire raid, because Stampeding Roar is an entire raid buff that you do bring, where you can make everybody go faster for a certain amount of time. So that might be good. It depends on the fight. There are some fights inside Cathlanathria where speed and movement is something that you might want to bring to help people move things around the room and or get out of stuff. Tireless Pursuit. For 2 seconds after leaving cat form or travel form, you retain up to 40% movement speed. Now this one's probably going to be better for I would say probably Boomy and Resto, because it'll give them that movement speed, especially if they're power shifting in and out of it. For us as Feral Druids, probably not a go-to because there shouldn't be too many instances where we're trying to leave cat form and we want that speed outside of cat form for too many things. So that's going to be the conduits going into Shadowlands that we have currently. Now they are doing tuning passes, and they said that the conduits themselves are supposed to be one of those things that's a tuning knob for our class. So they might buff up some of our potency ones to just have better throughput. If we're lacking on single target, they might buff taste for blood. You know, if we're just lacking overall abilities, if we're not getting tuned correctly, then Carnivorous Instinct's probably a good one for them to tune up, because then that would give the majority of our damage we're using just a straight damage buff increase if they were going to use this as tuning knobs. Now, going into the actual soulbinds that we have Naya, we have Dreamweaver, and we have Corian. All right, so Naya is the very first one you get. And something I want to go over really quickly before we go too far down these trees is that when you go into Shadowlands and you start, each one of these ranks that you get, each tier here that you get, is going to be attainable as you get renowned. And you only get so much renowned every single week, so you're only going to be able to unlock so much of this at the beginning of the expansion. It's going to take several weeks to get all the way down the trees and get all of the soulbinds active and get all these guys active. The first one you'll get is Naya with this first row, and then so on and so forth. It'll start unlocking. However, each one has its own damaging capabilities and potentials, and those are what we're going to be going over. But a lot of people are looking at these and thinking that they're going to be able to max out the tree and use its damage profile for what they have at the beginning of Shadowlands, and they're not going to be, because they're not going to be unlocked. First person you're going to get is Naya, and you're going to have to start working down her tree, and then if you want to jump around, you can. Corian's going to be the last one we get, though, and if he ends up being the best damage profile later on when he's fully unlocked, that's great, but you won't be able to use him at the beginning. You have to finish the Covenant campaign in order to get Corian fully unlocked. All right, so going over this, so for Naya here, the very first ability we have is Soul Shape. It's our signature Covenant ability, and what it does is it turns us into a Vulpin and gives us 3 different dashes and has 50% movement speed. It's just you generate 5% of your maximum health every 3 seconds. Now, this is going to be pretty strong in PvP, I would say, especially if you're kiting around or getting away. Some passive health is big. It could be something if you're kiting something inside a boss fight. This might be big too. After that, we have a potency conduits that I put Carnivorous Instincts inside. Now, I don't want to go over all the ones that I did not select, mainly because I want to say why these are the better ones for Feral Druid in comparison to the other ones. The first thing is since our conduits are strong, we're going to want all 3 potency ones. So if you see I selected all 3 of these potency ones, which kind of determines the exact path you're going to, besides maybe 1 or 2 options per tree. So going down here, we took the conduit. We have to take the finesse. It's shared between everybody. I took the stampeding roar one. The other big thing that Naya gives us is this right here. It's actually damage that she just purely gives us. Your interrupts apply Naya's paralytic poison to your target, dealing 7,759 damage, may vary, over 30 seconds. Targets with Naya's paralytic poisons take an additional 259 damage if interrupted once more. So it's a passive damage that you get from just interrupting. So interrupting is going to be a big thing for Feral Druids, which is great. After this one right here, we get 2 potency conduits, which I have placed both of these in for Taste of Blood and Conflux of the Elements. After that, I took Swiftness Patrol. Now, this is the one you can alter between these two because it's not going to matter because eventually you're going to get down here to Grove Irrigation anyway. But Swift Patrol, movement speed increased by 20% for 2 minutes after defeating an enemy. Combat cancels this effect. This is great. It just 20% increased speed going in between mobs is great anywhere. You know, open world content for world quest and questing, as well as going into dungeons. You know, you'll have 20% increased movement speed going in between packs, which is great. You could choose to have you have a chance to obtain leather, meat, and fish when you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor. So, you know, that's great for BGs, PvP orientated, definitely for sure. You can take that for selected open world PvP as well, but I definitely think that even in PvP that Swift Patrol will probably be very good for you. The last ability that we have is Grove Invigoration. Healing or dealing damage has a chance to grant you a stack of redirected anima up to 10. Convoke the Spirits grants you 1% maximum health and 35 mastery per stack for 30 seconds. It's a mastery buff for us. Our mastery increases our finisher's damage, and our bleeds damage, which is big. You know, having more mastery is never a bad thing. So having this passive ability that you get every single time you use your Convoke the Spirits, which is on a 2-minute cooldown. Every 2 minutes, you'll build up stacks in between those 2 minutes, and then press the ability and gain the amount of stacks you have. The only problem is how many stacks you actually generate between every 2-minute increment, which is obviously it's varied by what you proc. It's a chance, so it won't always be the same. Generally, I think I got about 5 to 10 or so in between what I was pressing. I definitely think that's something that they can boost up so that you can get to the full 10 stacks and keep it rolling. But you can get up to max. I definitely think that they need to buff its proc chance just a little bit. Going into Dreamweaver. So Dreamweaver here, the first one you're going to get is Convoke the Spirits, puts flowers at your feet for 10 seconds. That increase your haste by 10% while you stand within them. Now, haste for Feral Druids is not a bad stat to have, but it's definitely not the best one for us. Having some haste is definitely needed for some energy regeneration. Our bleeds are affected by haste if you have enough of it to actually make your ticks go faster. But the 10% haste increase right here, especially at the beginning, most people probably aren't going to be playing a haste build because they're going to be using other supplements for energy past haste. And also the big downfall for this one is that it places at your feet and you have to stand within them. So it's going to be on fights where you don't have to move. So that's already a drawback to this soulbind just for Feral. After that, you get a potency conduit. I placed Carnivorous Instincts in there. You do get a endurance conduit here, so you can put innate resolve in there and get that extra 12% heal. You get soothing voice when your roots, stuns, and incapacitating class effects expire or are dispelled. Your target's movement speed is reduced by 90%, decaying rapidly over 2 seconds. Definitely PvP. Then you have 2 potency conduits, which once again we slot in the same 2 ones that we have right now across the other 2 for Naya as well. And then after that, you have after spending 60 seconds in a rested area, you gain 20% increased movement speed for 30 minutes. This is kind of the same as the previous tiered one from Naya, but this one doesn't say that you lose it in combat or out of combat. You just gain it for 30 minutes, which is a nice little buff, especially since you're going to be in a hub more than likely before you jump out into the world, and all you have to do is remain 60 seconds inside there and you get 20% increased movement speed for 30 minutes. Not a bad one at all. You could take when falling further than 20 yards, fairy dust slows your fall. As druids, we don't really have too many issues with this. If you're any form of druid, you can go travel form and leap, and that will take your fall damage out. As feral druids ourselves, we take reduced fall damage from just being in cav form. So not a big one. I definitely think the speed is more so what we want to go with. After that, you have Pod Tender for the last ability on Dreamweaver. When you take damage that would kill you, instead rejuvenate within a Wild Seed, regaining 30% of your HP over 10 seconds. If the Wild Seed takes more than 13,150 damage during this time, you die. This effect may only occur once every 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes, it gives you a cheat death as long as you don't take damage when you die. I personally don't like cheat death mechanics all that much because most of the time if you died to something, there's something you could have done to prevent it. In Mythic Plus, this might help on a niche scenario where maybe your tank died and while he was getting battle res, you ended up tanking for a little while, you died by the time he actually got aggro back, and he had aggro, so you were able to get healed back up and come back out of the pod. That could be a pretty good scenario in a Mythic Plus. However, when Pod Tender contends with other damage increasing abilities like Naya's Mastery, this Soulbind becomes weaker for us from just a damage profile perspective. Then we're going to talk about the last one, which is Corian. So Corian has gone through some iterations recently over beta, but we'll go down the path that I would love to select for Corian. So Soul Shape increases the movement speed of allies within 40 yards by 10%. And this is great for groups because then you can share some of that movement speed with the entire group. So as a Night Fae, you can bring movement enhancing capability on top of Stampeding Roar. Then you have a Potency Conduit. put Carnivorous Instincts in there. You do get another defensive, which is an Endurance Conduit. Put an Innate Resolve in there. I would have loved for us to be able to have First Strike, because damaging an enemy before they damage you increases your chance to critically strike by 20% for 10 seconds. That crit damage would have been essential to some of our toolkit, right? It's only for the first 10 seconds, but in the first 10 seconds, when you have everything that you're busting off, especially with the rotation that comes with the Night Fae ability and making sure that you're using your Convoke the Spirits during a Tiger's Fury, you're going to be doing that within the first 10 seconds of a fight anyway, and that'll just give you 20% increased crit on top of all of that, which would have been great. However, it would force you to not take one potency conduit, which I don't believe is going to be worth the damage output that you can get within that first 10 seconds. So instead, we go over here with Face Your Foes. When in front of your target, your spells and abilities decrease the damage they inflict on you by 2% for 2 seconds. Alright, that's mainly a tank thing for sure, because you don't want to be in front of your target 99.9% of the time anyway. So this isn't that great for Druids. It's okay for, I guess, World Quest and questing content and stuff where you're going to be facing the target anyway. You just take a little bit decreased damage from it. It might be okay for PvP as well, because you'll take a little bit reduced damage and you're going to be facing your targets like that. But for PvE content, I don't believe that this is going to be that great of an ability. After that, you get 2 potency conduits in a row again, and then you have a choice between these two right here. Get in formation is your mounted movement speed is increased by 5%. Allies behind you within 40 yards gain this benefit. The other two are 20% increased movement speed. This one's only 5, and it's your mounted movement speed is increased by 5%. The other one is your weapon takes no durability damage. This one's actually really bad for us because we don't really use our weapons as feral druids, right? We're using our claws, not our weapon. The big one for Corian is the last ability, which is Wild Hunt Tactics. Your damage to targets above 75% health and healing to targets below 35% health is increased by 10%. When your spells and abilities are enhanced this way, you gain 10% increased movement speed for 5 seconds. Now, there's a lot of mobs that you can hit, obviously at the beginning, that are all going to be above 75% health, and you're going to automatically do 10% increased damage to them. That is huge. At the beginning of every Mythic Plus pull, you'll do 10% increased damage until those targets are lowered. At the beginning of every boss fight, you're going to be doing 10% increased damage until it gets below that 75% mark. Granted, in most raid boss fights, the boss staying above 75% health doesn't last all that long, but it's definitely a big damage increase for just flat 10% damage gained, which is huge. So this one might by itself carry this entire tree to be the best damage profile that we have across the spec for the path that you would take for having the potency conduits anyway. But the main one from this is going to be the Wild Hunt, having that 10% damage over 75% of the health on targets is going to help carry this tree. All right, this tree would be very strong if instead this potency conduit swapped with this this defensive one and allowed us to go straight down the middle and take first strike. This would definitely, I would say, probably jump to the head of the pack. Naya is the first one we get, and her abilities that she gives us, Naya's Poison, which this is obviously used only on casters, but it gives you that extra damage, but then also Grove Invigoration gives us all that mastery, and if you can make sure, if they do help the procs get to 10 every single time between your 2-minute intervals, that would be very, very big for the Feral Druid as well. The Interrupt Poison and the Grove Invigoration is pretty much going up to bat against the Wild Hunt Tactics. That's pretty much the only things I can see from a damage profile for Druids that they gain from being Night Fae inside the Soulbind Conduits. So it's either going to be Naya or Corian. Corian looks a little bit better on a lot of scenarios, especially for startup damage, which is always a big thing when you're a bleed class and you're placing up bleeds. Some of that startup damage is kind of necessary to get you going, and then your bleeds and your damage profile after that, once you have everything rolling on your targets, will carry you off after that first 25% of boss's health. So that is probably going to be a pretty big deal going into the Shadowlands. Alright, so now that we've talked about some of the base abilities, the talents that we have, some of the talent rework that we have, we went over the soulbinds, the conduits, you know, and the situation going on with the selection of those. The big thing that a lot of those are revolving around with inside the soulbinds and the conduits is going to be the actual abilities themselves. For Night Fade, the abilities that we get is called Convoke the Spirits. It's a channeled spell, has a 2-minute duration. Call upon the Night Fade for an eruption of energy, channeling a rapid flurry of 12 Druid spells and abilities over 4 seconds. You will cast Wild Growth, Swift Mend, Moonfire, Wrath, Regrowth, Rejuvenation, Rake, and Thrash on appropriate nearby targets, favoring your current shapeshift form. Now, there's a couple things with this. One, the tooltip is not completely accurate to all the spells and abilities that this signature ability does do. And the big thing is that for Feral Druids, it will also cast Ferocious Bite at full combo points, at full energy for full damage profiling, which is huge. And it doesn't say that in there. It'll also cast Feral Frenzy. It also casts Tiger's Fury. So there are abilities that it's not mentioning in here that it does absolutely cast, which is making this ability that much stronger. They did nerf it from 16 spells to 12, which did take a big chunk of our damage profile out of this ability, but it did bring it more online with other Covenant abilities. So now it's not our best by all means, but it is very strong still. So with this ability, the objective here is you're going to roll the dice to try to get an optimized roll on Ferocious Bites mainly to pump out the damage. Okay, the other ability we get from the Night Fade is Soul Shape. We've talked about this a little bit during the Soulbinds. Turn into, for me, it's a Dragon Turtle, teleporting you 15 yards forward and increasing your movement speed by 50%. You may reactivate Soul Shape every few seconds to teleport again. Last 12 seconds or indefinitely while in a rested area. The cool thing about this ability, and I can show it to you real quick right now, is, see, I'm a Dragon Turtle, and the reason why I'm a Dragon Turtle is because you can customize the shape that you go into. Normally it's a Vulpin, but you can customize it because you can get these abilities, these little tokens. This one I actually got from our Sanctum's Garden that you get, the Wild Seed Garden, which allowed me to get this, and then you talk to this memory of shapes right here, and you can change it up. And you can go to Vulpin, Horned Horse, or you can go to the ones that I've gotten is Tiger and Bear, and there's several others. There's a lot of these that you can change into. This ability is really cool because it allows you to do the teleporting. The big drawback for Feral Druids is that what it does is it will take you out of Feral form and put you back into caster form. So this will be more of a power shift thing. If you have to get out of the way of something, it does negate fall as well. It will teleport you to the floor if you use it as you're falling towards the floor, as long as it's within range. So you use it right before you hit the floor, it will negate fall damage. But it also gives you 3 teleports that you can use if you use them very quickly, that you can use to get away, pretty much. The teleport it gives us is not strong enough to pass the mob, really. So it's not going to be utilized in that aspect, I wouldn't think. It would definitely allow you to quickly get away from something very quickly if you don't have any of your normal speed enhancements available. So going back to our main ability here, which is the bread and butter of Night Fae, which is our Convoke the Spirits. So convoking, it casts those 12 spells, and it casts spells that once again aren't shown in the tooltip, which are Ferocious Bite, Tiger's Fury, Frenzy. The big thing that it's doing here, though, it's just casting duplicates of the spell. They're not special spells, they're not independent, they are the same exact spells that we have on our base toolkit. So when it casts Ferocious Bite, it is casting the same Ferocious Bite. And what that means is that we can enhance the Ferocious Bites that it is casting, or any of the abilities that it is casting. So there's ways to buff Convoke the Spirits with your basic rotation. Things like our Sabertooth, which increases the damage of Ferocious Bite by an additional 20%. Every time that Convoke the Spirits procs this during its rotation, for the 12 spells it does in 4 seconds, the Ferocious Bites will get the 20% damage amplifier to it as well. It'll also get the amplifier from the Conduit, which gives us 3% per bleed that we have. The other thing is during Convoke the Spirits, you can proc Blood Talons if you have Blood Talons selected, which is another big reason to have Convoke, because it'll proc its own Blood Talons. You can proc the first Blood Talons for it. That way, if it does anything right off the get-go, you'll have those abilities. And if you're doing the rotation correctly, and what I believe is the correct way to do it currently, you'll have Blood Talon, 2 Blood Talon procs going into Convoke, so that you can have your your damage up for when it does do its Ferocious Bite. So you'll have 30% increase for the Ferocious Bites going into it for at least the first 2 of them. You'll have 20% from Sabertooth. You'll have the 9% from the Conduit, and then you have 5% from Soul of the Forest. On top of, you're definitely going to have Tiger's Fury up when you convoke, so you get additional 15%, 18% with the Conduit on top of all of that. That damage profile definitely puts a big emphasis on Sabertooth with Convoke. But Sabertooth isn't the only thing during Convoke that we can buff, right? Tiger's Fury is going to buff all damage spells that are inside the Convoke's casting. Anything that we have on healing will also be amplified for anything that it casts healing-wise, because it can cast healing spells as well. But we're going to focus mainly on the damage ones, because that's what we want for the damage profile. But what else can we buff? It's going to cast Rake, and it's going to cast Shred too. So now with the reworks that they did to Berserk, Berserk now will allow you to cast Rake and Shred to deal damage as though you were stealthed, giving each finishing move a 20% chance per combo point spent to refund 2 combo points. Alright, the combo point's not the big portion of it, but the Rake and Shred dealing damage as though you were stealthed is. You're going to end up using 4 seconds out of your 20 seconds of Berserk on this, but it's definitely, I believe, worthwhile, because then every single ability that you use during your Convoke is more than likely going to be empowered in some form or another. If it's a finishing move, it's going to be empowered by Soul of the Forest. If it's Sabertooth specifically, it's going to be empowered by all the modifiers we just listed. If it's Rake or if it's Shred, it's going to be empowered not only by Tiger's Fury, but also by Berserk's increased stealth damage to it as well. So you want to make sure that you're enhancing all of those abilities going into it, which makes Convoke very strong outside of just what it does baseline. There are other things that I want to talk about with Convoke, though, that do go straight into the damage profile. Some people are memeing about it, but it's something we've done in the past before when we used to have Heart of the Wild as well. Back then, you would go into Heart of the Wild as a boomkin at the start of a fight and utilize it to put out damage as a boomkin. Currently, it's still very strong to do that once every 5 minutes. Your Heart of the Wild is a 5-minute CD that you have that will, if you select Balance Affinity, allow you to go into that spec and utilize its abilities while Convoke is active. Now, this is purely, I would say, for a AoE scenario. I believe our single target Convoke is still worthwhile just staying inside Fertile Form for. But inside Mythic Plus, you can definitely go into Heart of the Wild with the Balance Affinity active, and it'll cast Full Moon, it'll cast Starfall, and then it'll cast all of its other abilities like it normally would. The big ones here going into it is that when you go into an AoE pack, you can jump into it, you can put up all your bleeds, get your Primal Wrath going, get your Thrash going on everything, and once you have that going on all of your targets, you press Heart of the Wild, you press Convoke while trying to stand a little bit further away from the targets just because you don't want to Thrash continuously, and Thrash being procced in Convoke is based on your range to the target. So you back up a little bit from the targets, you press Heart of the Wild, you press Convoke right afterwards, and what that will do is that will cast Starfall and all of your Boomkin abilities, putting up some Moonfires and Sunfires on your targets for 4 seconds, and cast all those abilities within 4 seconds, and then you jump right back into Fertile Form and get your bleeds rotating back up, and that damage profile makes for very big burst damage on AoE once every 5 minutes that you can utilize, doubling into the spec. So you can use all the Boomkin AoE abilities as well as all of the Fertile AoE abilities within that damage profile. So Convoke works really well with that Heart of the Wild. Now, outside of just damage potential here, there's other aspects to the game than just pure throughput on damage. All right, Convoke will cast whatever spells you're shifted into. So if you go into caster form, it's going to cast a whole bunch of healing spells. If you do it in Boomkin, it's going to do all of ranged casting abilities. Do it in Fertile, we just discussed what that does. If you do it in Tank, it'll do healing abilities. It'll also grant Iron Furs and so on, going through all of them. So you can utilize this as a defensive or an off healing capability as well, depending on what the group needs. Mainly, you want to use it for damage because it's very, very big on our damage profile. It's a huge amount of damage that you won't be able to get back, but it's also something every 2 minutes, if you had to, you could contribute. Going into raid, instead of going for the balance affinity, depending on what the fight is, if there's not a really big AoE burst phase to the fight, then you might be able to throw that on a restoration affinity and use your Convoke for a big healing phase that needs to be done, that you need a little bit of an off heal. You know, previous expansions, Frail Druids had Tranquility that we could use kind of in that same niche scenario. Now, if you really needed to, or if you thought that it would actually give you a head inside a raid format, you can go Resto Affinity with Heart of the Wild into Resto, and then cast Convoke from caster form and get some really big juicy heals out over those 4 seconds, because it's going to just spam out a whole bunch of hots over your raid, which could be something that might be utilized in more of a niche situation, but definitely something if you needed a little bit more healing to get past a portion of it, you could always have a Druid Convoke during that in caster form and get those heals rolling out. Past that, Convoke, although it did get nerfed by 4 spells, which is 25% of it, it's still very strong in my opinion. It is more of an RNG, roll the dice, hopefully you get a good roll on your how many ferocious bites you deal. Typically, you get around 2 to 3 on average. Sometimes you'll get the 4th one, but typically it's around 2 to 3. Before it was around 3 to 4. Now it's about 2 to 3 that you get. There are that one-off chance where you do roll really bad on the die and you get the 1 ferocious bite, which will feel like a very bad moment going in there. Especially also if you start casting a whole bunch of regrowths or rejuves going out on targets, that doesn't feel that great either. Having 1 regrowth is probably pretty much guaranteed, but over the span of it, there are times where you just don't cast any healing spells and it's purely damage. There are times where you'll cast multiple healing spells and only 1 or 2 ferocious bites, and that's the problem with the Night Fate one, is that it is more RNG. But like I said, consistently across the board, it has definitely been a very good damage profiling ability in my opinion, and it's very versatile in how you can use it and how you can make abilities synergize with it. Alright, so one of the last systems that we're going to be talking about here in Shadowlands is the legendaries. The legendaries that Feral Druids have available going into the Shadowlands that we can start working towards obtaining and getting them to help enhance our playstyles, our rotations, and so on. They did add recently this right here, this little power section to it. I do have all the legendaries that we're going to be talking about here on Pieces of Gear as well. So going down the list of what is our generic ones, and then going from generic into specific feral ones. So the generic ones are typically ones that go across all specs. Feral Druids actually make out pretty well here with the generic ones though, because a lot of the generic ones are actually more geared towards, in my opinion, Feral Druids than any other spec there is, because a lot of them synergize with multiple of our abilities, whereas other specs for Druid, it only synergizes 1 or 2 spells that it affects. So the first one here, Drought of the Deep Focus. When Moonfire, Rake, Rip, or Rejuvenation are active on a single target, their effectiveness are increased by 30%. Now, there's obviously instant drawbacks to this one because it has to be on 1 target. No AoE component to this at all. So this will be probably one of those legendaries that people will get far, far down the road when you have an abundance of other legendaries that you're already comfortable with and you want to optimize that 1 single target fight that you can really pump out on. That's where this one will come into play. The other drawback to this one, other than it just being single target, is that it says Moonfire, Rake, and Rip. So Moonfire, obviously the only time Feral Druid is going to use that is if we take Lunar Inspiration. This one does heavily incentivize using Lunar Inspiration, but Lunar Inspiration still might not come ahead to be the choice over Sabertooth for things that we've talked about with synergies with other abilities that we have in Conduits. So you might not be taking Moonfire. So you might only be buffing Rake and Rip with this legendary. And the problem with Rake and Rip is that on a single target damage profile for Feral Druids, our bleeds just don't do a huge portion of our damage profile. Typically, they're doing anywhere from about 10 to 12% damage, and that's mainly Rip doing 10 to 12. Rake is typically lower than that by a couple percentage, but neither one of them are doing a huge portion of our single target damage. Our bleeds just aren't tuned to do that anymore with the current build of Feral Druids, and that that becomes a problem with this legendary as well, jumping into Shadowlands. They'd have to do a pretty big rework to take us back to where our bleeds are our main damage profile in order for this to come ahead massively. After that one, we have Circle of Life and Death. Now this one is Jagged Wounds. It's a nerfed version of Jagged Wounds, but if anybody remembers the Furl talent Jagged Wounds back in the day, that ability increased the pace at which your bleeds did their damage by 33%. This one does it by 25%. Your damage over time effects deal their damage in 25% less time, and your healing over time effects in 15% less time. So this one actually plays double dips into Furl Druids because we can use the heal and we can use all the damage over time effects, which it affects all damage over time effects, which will come into play on our Maldraxxus video as well. But this one right here, it's just makes everything go faster for you. One of the big problems with playing a Furl Druid or any kind of dot bleed class is that if stuff dies before your bleed reaches its full duration, you wasted damage, right? You wasted time on those damaging abilities because you didn't get the full potential damage value of them. This helps you do that so that you do get all the potential value from them, and it also allows you to have a better rotation where you're not just spamming builders and spenders, but you're also managing this more because you're keeping the uptime on your bleeds. It will be more relevant to keep pressing those bleeds more often to keep them going. This is a decent overall strong legendary. Jagged Wounds was very strong back in the day, and it created some great gameplay. This still has some of the issues with Drought of the Deep Focus, where our bleeds aren't the biggest portion of our damage profile. Now in AoE, however, this can come into a pretty big play when you're using this with Primal Wrath, because this one doesn't have what the Drought of the Deep Focus does, where it's only single target. This one can be used on all AoE. So if you have your Primal Wrath up on everything and Thrash up on everything, then it's doing all of its damage 25% less time, so 25% faster pretty much, and that's pretty big on AoE. There is some synergies that this will have if we ever do end up being able to equip 2 legendaries, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But overall, this is a great legendary to have. I don't think it's going to be the strongest off the get-go just because our bleeds aren't the biggest portion of our damage profile, but it is definitely a very strong legendary, especially for it being a general legendary and not a Furl specific legendary. Alright, moving on to the next one, we have Oath of the Elder Druid. Effects of Thick Hide, Astral Influence, Feline Swiftness, and Ysera's Gift increase by 75%. When you shift into your affinity form, you gain Heart of the Wild for 10 seconds once every 1 minute. This I don't think is going to play that much into Furl Druid too much. It is a general one, and it's just plain and simple. It's not as strong as any of the other legendaries I think we really have. I think that this might come into play with maybe Resto Druids and Mythic Plus because they're going to be shifting into Cat more than likely, and this will give them a little bit of that damage input from it. So every so often they can shift back and forth into Furl and do some damage. But outside of Resto, I don't see too many other specs utilizing this legendary. The last one of our general Druid legendaries is Lakara's Fleeting Glimpse. Every 45 seconds while in combat, cast a spell based on your form. So no form is Wild Growth, Cat form is Primal Wrath, Bear form is Barkskin, Moonkin form is Starfall, and Travel form is Stampeding Roar. Off the get-go from this, it wouldn't be that strong, just because you look at, oh, it's from Cat form, Primal Wrath. Primal Wrath is not a good thing to actually have cast every 45 seconds in combat, and the reason for that is because Primal Wrath is a bleed that we snapshot, right? So we can Tiger's Fury a full Primal's Wrath, and if we end up having this proc sometime during that Primal Wrath, it will override that spell and give us a lesser bleed on something we've already snapshotted, which is something we never really want to do, right? The only potential I can see from this one is the other counterparts that it has, mainly the Moonkin form one. If you're taking Balance Affinity, which you should be, as a Furl Druid, because of damage components that you get from it, the range plus being able to use Heart of Wild and Convoke during AoE. This one, you can use that Starfall if you go Boomkin. Obviously there's going to be a way to track this with a weak aura, that you'll be able to know every 45 seconds while you're in combat, I can shift into Boomkin and get a free Starfall. that might be pretty good. The only problem with while testing this is it's every 45 seconds while in combat. And what that means is you have to be in combat for 45 seconds before this will proc the first time. And how many, especially in Mythic Plus, on AoE where Starfall would be useful, how many times does the mobs last a full 45 seconds? Or, you know, maybe you'll get that 145 seconds, but it dies 10 seconds after that. Getting a Starfall in on that time, probably not the best, but it could be if there's a full AoE fight, kind of like Hive Mind, where you know that this fight's going to go on for a decent amount of time, then this might be something that you might look into. I still don't think it's going to have anywhere near the damage potential some of our actual legendaries do. So speaking of those, let's go ahead and start talking about them. So the first one, we got Frenzy Band. This is our first Feral Druid specific legendary. Combo point generating abilities reduce the cooldown of Berserk by 0.2 seconds. During Berserk, they cause the target to bleed for an additional 50% of the damage over 8 seconds. Now, this is something that would have been great if they baked it just into Berserk, but as a legendary, it's pretty lackluster because your Berserk is already a 3-minute cooldown, and even though Berserk does have a better damage profile on itself right now, it's just not that strong, I would say, in comparison to some of the other legendaries. This was a previous tier set, and it fits more of that niche than I think it would like an actual legendary item. Berserk was only fixed because they took everything out of Inkar and put it into Berserk. They should probably just put Frenzy Band into Inkar to give you another incentivized reason for going there, or reduce the cooldown on Berserk and make this one have a stronger damage profile because you'll be able to use it twice as much. So if Berserk was a 1.5 minute cooldown instead of 3 minutes, then that would definitely create this as or make this a better legendary. But as it stands right now through testing, it's just not that strong to have. Berserk is already a good cooldown now with the rework to use, and having this on top of it, it's just not needed outside of what the other legendaries can do for more consistent damage instead of 3-minute cooldown. Going to the next one, we have Eye of Fearful Symmetry. Tiger's Fury causes your next finishing move to restore 3 combo points. This one, we'll definitely start talking about this one because in a AoE scenario inside Mythic Plus or a dungeon just in general, when you get those Predator resets, then you can have Tiger's Fury up a lot, and then your next finishing move will restore 3 combo points. But every time you use a finishing move inside that AoE, which will probably be Primal Wrath or Ferocious Bite, all you're doing is getting 3 combo points, and it literally takes 2 GCDs right now to get more than 3 combo points typically when you're AoE, when you're swiping and using Thrash and so on. So this one right here, in testing for me, I didn't like it that much. It just didn't feel like it sped up the rotation. It actually felt like I was just overcapping a lot of the time versus being able to utilize that to its full potential. Probably not the best legendary in my opinion. It just doesn't seem to synergize well with how Feral Druids play inside that AoE scenario, which is where you would use it. Single target wise, it's not going to be strong enough because you're literally only getting 3 combo points every finishing move, and that's finishing moves within Tiger's Fury. And it's only your next finishing move. It's not all finishing moves within Tiger's Fury, it's just your next finishing move within Tiger's Fury, which makes it weak. The next 2 are extremely good. So this first one right here, Apex Predator's Carving. Rip damage has a 4% chance to make your next Ferocious Bite free and deal the maximum damage. So it means that it's going to do a full Ferocious Bite as if it had full 5 combo points and full energy on it, so it'll have that increased damage potential on it. Now, a lot of people, when they look at this, they see 4% and they're like, that is not enough. That's not high enough percent chance for it to proc. And the simple fact is, while testing it, it absolutely is. It'd be nice if it was higher, of course. I would never doubt that. It'd be great if it was higher. But you're typically going to be using this on AoE, not mainly single target. AoE-wise, when you're sitting there and you put your Primal Wrath up on 5 to 6 targets, you have 4% chance 6 different times, every single time that your rip deals its damage, to get a free Ferocious Bite at full damage, which is very strong, and it definitely procs quite often, even for it to be being only at that 4% chance. I would like it to be increased a little bit, mainly for single target purposes. I think single target, that it would become a very good single target legendary if it procced a little bit more single target, but AoE, it's definitely a great legendary to have, especially when you start getting into higher mythic pluses where things aren't just falling over instantly. You have a little bit more time for those things to proc up their chances. Since rip is also uncapped, if you get into a mythic plus group where you're pulling big and you can put your rip across 8 to 10 targets, you have 8 to 10 times the amount for 4% chance procs off of every single tick that you have on your rip, which gives you pretty much every single time your rip does damage, you will get a proc. It's not guaranteed, of course. It is a 4% chance, but every big pull I've used it on, I've gotten procs pretty much one right after the other going into it, which is a lot of damage, especially when we talked about the damage profile that you can make for Ferocious Bite. Ferocious Bite increases do affect the Predator proc as well. Now, there is also something else that affects the Predator proc from this. On our talents, with Soul of the Forest, the base 5% does generate it, but that's not the one that I was actually going to talk about. It's the energy. So the energy on this one is that for every combo point you use, it gives you 5 energy back. And this is pretty big because all on those free Ferocious Bites that you get, it will give you the 5 energy per combo point that it would have spent if it was a full 5 combo point finisher. And that's huge because that also gives you energy regeneration back by having this proc. And sometimes that feels great because sometimes you'll have 5 combo points, and this happens very often for some reason. I'll be having 5 combo points waiting to get to that 50 energy so that I can hit that Ferocious Bite, and instead I'll proc a Ferocious Bite and be able to spam that Ferocious Bite, and when I spam that Ferocious Bite out because it's free, it gives me the energy to be above 50 energy to hit Ferocious Bite once again right afterwards at full damage potential, giving you that double Ferocious Bite back-to-back damage, and that's huge. That's very strong. I definitely think this is going to be one of our best AoE legendaries, especially in Mythic Plus for Shadowlands. Also in the future, just looking ahead a little bit, if we do get aware 2 legendaries, this plus Circle of Life and Death, where you can have all of those rips doing their damage 25% faster, or in 25% less time, then you'll get even more procs, and you'll be able to pretty much use it every single time it procs and just sit there and spam out some Apex Predator Carvings legendary procs on your targets, which pretty much makes us like the sub rogue on Zool, where you use AoE to funnel in on a target, which is pretty big. And I can definitely see if you have an optimized group, especially in Mythic Plus or inside Raid, where you have a couple of targets, and being able to just keep them alive or pull into a boss or on top of a boss just for the sole fact that you want to keep those targets, those lesser mobs alive, so that you can proc off single target funnel into a boss for big single target damage. That's definitely a damage profile that Druids can play with Apex Predator Carving. So highly rated legendary here. Cat-Eye Curio. This is the other really big legendary that we have. Clear casting abilities generate 25% of their energy cost, and your maximum energy is increased by 60%. Now, this tied into Moment of Clarity will give you a full 190 energy. So like right now, if I were to put this on, it's going to boost up my energy pool all the way to 190, almost double what our energy pool is. Not quite, but almost there. And what that does is that having Moment of Clarity and having this with that big damage pool, it allows us so many avenues of just being able to use our abilities, especially at the start of the expansion, to be able to use our abilities to put out that damage. It allows us to use Tiger's Fury and optimize it so we're not just wasting the energy that it's giving us, especially on death resets, because since Tiger Fury is not on the GCD, every single time something dies, you can hit this without worrying about it interfering with your rotation and still have the energy used from it, which gives you almost infinite energy if you use it in Mythic Plus as stuff is dying, which is great. And the reason why that's great is because that pretty much means that you don't have to push into haste for energy regen purposes anyway. This allows you just to continuously have infinite energy if stuff is dying, periodically anyway, by getting you those Tiger's Fury sets and being able to house all of that energy. It also allows Ferocious Bites to pretty much be cast as soon as you have 5 combo points, because you have an energy pool, and it's much easier to be above 50 energy when you have 190 energy pool. And most of the time when I'm going into a combat situation and I'm doing the rotation, popping Tiger's Fury, popping Berserk, and going at it, there's every single time you get to 5 combo points, you can immediately smash Ferocious Bite because you have 50 energy, which is a big thing. You're not pooling, you're not waiting, you're not giving a GCD outside of your burst that you want, because this Cat Eye Curio legendary allows you to have that energy. It doesn't require you, but if you pair it up with Moment of Clarity for that increased energy pool, you do lose out on the 30% increased damage from Blood Talons. But some of that damage is just made up by being able to push out more damage in more of a spam fashion than sitting there and waiting and pulling so that you can have 30% additional damage on your bleeds. Especially for single target, I definitely think that this comes ahead, because your Shred will start doing more direct damage, and it will also allow you to get more Ferocious Bites out, which is your highest damaging profile ability on single target, which is pretty essential. Having that 30% is big, but if you can only 30%, let's say, 4 or 5 Ferocious Bites on a single target if you're lucky, that 30% increased damage over those is compared then to maybe being able to pump out 7 to 9 Ferocious Bites instead. And it really, obviously, that's a number game that comes out to it. It definitely feels very nice having that much energy, and being able to do a solid rotation is definitely a very good way to feel about Feral Druid. Alright, so now that we've talked about every avenue that is coming to Feral Druids in the Shadowlands, with the exception of a few things that we'll be getting, like trinkets and so on, the layered systems that we have, Feral Druid does feel pretty good, especially in the Night Fae Covenant. Playing a Druid and playing multiple specs, I definitely can see a future in the Night Fae Covenant because of what the ability allows us to do. I can definitely see some counterplay with some good utility brought from Convoke, and not using it for just damage, but using it for utility as well if you have to in certain niche situations. But overall, I do like the damage profile that Convoke the Spirits brings. Soul Shape is an okay ability. It's not as powerful for Feral Druids as it is for other classes, but it does give us another capability of movement and blinking out of something or reducing fall damage. I like our Conduits and I like our legendaries. I think that they all have good synergy with a lot of the things we have in our toolkit that will allow us to progress decently well. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to what I have to say about Feral Druids. This video was very long and is going to be the longest one out of the series. The other videos, when I go into the other covenants, will be referring back to segments of this video. That way we don't have to go over things like talents, Conduits, and what they do. Same thing with legendaries. There's synergies that the other covenants have. I will make sure that I reference those when I go over the other covenants. But once again, thank you very much for tuning in. If you like this video, if you want to see more content like it, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at SageShifter. Same thing over in Twitch. I do stream every so often, and that's going to be twitch.tv/SageShifter on that one as well. If you have any recommendations to the video, if there's anything that I missed, please feel free to comment down below and let me know what you think and what I can improve on in the video, or what you think I've missed for Feral Druids going into Shadowlands pertaining to, well, anything really.